Welcome to Moonlit Romantic, your place for love stories, told in the quiet hours, where hearts are revealed as softly as the tide comes in. Tonight's tale is The Prince in Disguise. Far from the glittering halls of the palace, a crown prince walks cobblestone streets as a stranger, trading royal duty for the salt-kissed air of a humble seaside town. But when he meets a woman who sees him not for his title, but for the man he is, he'll learn that love, true love, is the most daring disguise of all. So draw the covers close, let the world outside fall away, and step into a story where the heart rules the crown. Chapter 1. Arrival in Albrecht. Sophie Bennett pressed her forehead lightly to the train window and watched the countryside unspool in watercolor greens. Hills rose and fell like gentle breaths stitched with stone walls and tidy vineyards. Village steeples pricked the sky at even intervals, each one a neat exclamation point in a paragraph of slate roofs. She had traveled for work more times than she could count, but rarely had arrival felt like an exhale. Albrecht, the small mountain kingdom, nestled between more famous neighbors, looked as if it had been folded by a careful hand and left under glass. The conductor's soft announcement came in the kingdom's lilting language, and then in English, and Sophie gathered her tote and camera bag. She liked this moment between places, when a journey was not quite done, and a story had not yet begun, when possibility hummed at the edges, like a held note. On the platform, the air was cool and bright, with the faint perfume of wood smoke. Festival banners fluttered along the station's ironwork in shades of wine and gold. She paused to read a sign illustrated with dancing figures. In traditional dress, Cultural Week of Albrecht. Music, craft, and bread for all. Bread for all was a promise she could get behind. Her assignment had been both enviable and urgent. She was to cover the festival's softer heart, the artisans behind the stalls, the bakers with flour on their sleeves, the fiddlers who could charm clouds into moving. She would wander cobblestone lanes, gather gentle scenes, and stitch them into a piece that would feel like a lullaby on paper. A different department at her magazine had chased harder news lately. Sophie had been grateful for the reprieve, and yet part of her mind flickered with the old curiosity, the one that had made her climb fences and follow rumors. It was that part Nora, her editor, teased as a compass tuned to trouble. Her phone chimed with a new message. Your local guide will meet you on the platform. Name, Daniel Cross. He will have a festival badge. Be kind. Be kind, Sophie murmured, amused, as if she traveled with anything else in her pocket. She turned and found him. He stood a little apart from the bustle, a tall man with an easy stance and a badge clipped to a dark jacket. His hair was close cropped, wind-swept at the edges, and the set of his shoulders suggested old habits of awareness. But it was the warmth of his expression that steadied her, like seeing a familiar street light on an unknown road. Miss Bennett, he asked, voice low and calm. Sophie, she corrected out of reflex, then colored softly. If you like, you must be Daniel. Daniel Cross, he said, and the name fit easily in his mouth. Welcome to Albrecht." They shook hands. His palm was warm, the brief pressure assured without being presumptuous. Sophie noticed the small details she always noticed: a thin scar near his knuckle, a watch with a plain strap, the way his gaze flicked around them once, doors, exits, routes, before settling back on her. You could tell a lot about a person by what their eyes counted when they thought no one was looking. "Your luggage?" he asked. "Just this," she said, lifting her tote. "I travel light." "Good," he said. "This city is best met on foot." He guided her through the station and out into a square, paved in pale stone. The afternoon had slid toward evening, while the train wove its ribbon through the hills, and now the sky wore a delicate peach. Music floated from a nearby street, fiddle and drum, and somewhere close, a baker's door opened on a bloom of cinnamon. "Where are we staying?" she asked, falling into stride beside him. "An inn near the old gate," he said. "It keeps quiet rooms above a tavern that knows when to hush. The owner sings after closing, ballads and old lullabies. She pretends not to like it when people ask for encores." Sophie smiled. "You must be very persuasive." "Not I," he said. "The regulars. I only listen." They passed a fountain crowned with a bronze hair, its patina darkened by rain and time. Daniela, her grandmother, who had taught her the comfort of stories, would have called it a good omen. Sophie felt the thought settle like a small stone in her pocket. "You've been a guide long?" she ventured. "Long enough to know which streets don't like heels," he said, then added as if that answer needed polishing, "and long enough to admit I never stopped learning the city." There was something in the way he said it, a respectful softness, like a craftsman speaking of his tools, or a gardener of weather. It tugged at the corner of her curiosity. She watched him another heartbeat, then looked ahead, letting the quiet reknit. She did not need to interrogate a man whose job was to show her bakeries. But the story part of her brain underlined him anyway. Daniel Cross, soft-spoken, watchful, knows when songs begin, counts exits without breaking a smile. They crossed under stone arches, into a narrower street where lanterns had already been lit. Cloth awnings leaned out like polite neighbors, and the festival's bunting laced from window to window in generous loops. A woman in a red skirt appeared in a doorway and shook a dusting of flour from her hands. "Bread for all?" Sophie asked, half to herself. Daniel heard. "Try the seed loaf," he said, "and the honey butter, and perhaps allow room for cherry cake after." "You speak like a man who has made mistakes and learned from them," she said gravely. "The cake makes all of us wiser," he answered, not quite hiding his smile. They reached the inn tucked beneath a painted sign of a fox curled around a sprig of rosemary. Inside, the tavern held a low, warm light. The proprietor, a woman with silver hair, braided neatly, greeted Daniel by name, and Sophie as if she had been expected since spring. "You will like the window," she told Sophie, pressing a key into her palm. "It looks on rooftops and the small piece of sky that belongs to street cats." Sophie climbed the narrow stairs, Daniel at her shoulder, carrying nothing, and yet somehow bearing the easy weight of a companionable silence. Her room was exactly as promised. A whitewashed space with a wooden bed, a quilt in wine and cream, and a window that did indeed frame rooftops, and a disreputable cat. She set her tote down, rested her camera on the desk, and breathed. Outside, a violin's high note threaded the evening. "I know it is early," Daniel said from the doorway, "but if you like, I can show you where the lantern walk begins. Tonight they bless the river." "I would like that," she said, already tugging gently at the laces of her boots. "Give me a moment." He nodded and disappeared down the stairs. She glanced at her phone, reception a thin whisper, and sent a quick note to Nora. Arrived. Festival is a pocket watch of loveliness. Guide is competent. She paused, then added, "Also a bit of a poem in a jacket." She erased the last line and replaced it with something sensible about schedule. It was just travel copy, after all. No need to confess that her guide's voice had a way of smoothing the air. When she rejoined him, the tavern had grown busier. Men and women with festival ribbons pinned to their coats leaned across tables, making emphatic gestures that translated anywhere in the world to "you must taste this." Daniel waited near the door, the late light catching on the angle of his jaw. A peculiar thought landed in her mind, with both feet. He would look right at home, in a painting hung in a long hall. She shook it away. They stepped back into evening. Past the square, the streets opened toward the river, which ran like a dark ribbon under the last of the sun. Children carried paper lanterns painted with flowers and stars. The lanterns were not really needed yet, but they glowed anyway, small, bright promises cupped like fruit. Sophie took her camera without thinking, but after a heartbeat, she lowered it again. Not yet. Some scenes wanted to be held with the naked eye first. "Do you know the blessing?" she asked. "A little," Daniel said. "It is old and kind. The priest speaks, but the river does not mind who says the words." They joined the slow procession to a low bridge. The crowd was gentle, hands guiding, voices quiet, as if the dark had asked for room. Daniel kept her on the inside of the walkway, away from the press when it tightened. He did it without fuss, a simple angling of his arm, and she noticed the way his attention brushed outward and back, like a lighthouse beam making its round. She felt oddly safe. When the priest's voice rose and the lanterns were tipped toward the water, she watched her guide instead of the river. He bowed his head, lashes briefly shadowing his cheek, and Sophie, who was meant to notice festivals, not men, noticed. Someone jostled her then, an apology swallowed by the murmur of the crowd, and Sophie's heel slipped on the damp stone. A hand found her waist, sure as the newel post at the bottom of the stair. "Easy," Daniel murmured, voice close to her ear. She steadied, breath catching more from the nearness than the misstep. "Thank you," she said, softer than she intended. He released her immediately, as if the contact were a privilege that expired the moment it was no longer needed. The river accepted its blessing, lantern light winking as it drifted downstream. After, they walked without destination, which was Sophie's favorite way of traveling. Daniel showed her a small square where an old woman sold hand-carved birds. He showed her a doorway where a cat slept on a cushion like royalty. He pointed out the best bench for sunrise, the shortest line for coffee, the small chapel where the ceiling had been painted by a man who loved blue, You live nearby? She asked, when the night had folded itself comfortably around them. Close enough to hear the bells, he said. And your family? He hesitated, barely, the way a man steps over a shallow puddle. They are here, he said, and everywhere. He glanced at her with a little apology. Forgive me. That is not meant to be mysterious, only true in the way families can be. She accepted that gentleness. I understand. Mine are scattered like dandelion seeds. They always find their ground, he said, and somehow made it sound like a promise. They paused at the edge of a square, where a trio played under a string of lights. A few couples danced, awkwardly at first, then with a courage that made awkwardness part of the charm. Sophie felt the music press against her ribs, asking to be let in. Daniel's hand hovered, then withdrew. Would you like? He asked, and stopped, the offer tucked back before it fully unfolded. She smiled down at her boots. I am very good at stepping on toes. I have spare toes, he replied, quiet as a secret. She nodded, placed her hand in his, and let herself be drawn toward the music. He did not lead with flourish. He led like a person walks with a lantern, steady, attentive, willing to pause. Her palm rested in his, and the heat of his skin felt like a thread drawn between them. Around them, the square softened to blur. They turned slowly, a simple step and sway, and Sophie thought for the first careless time that perhaps work could be gentle, and love could arrive as calmly as a train gliding into a well-lit station. He did not ask questions while they danced. He did not fill the air with his story. He seemed to understand that silence can be a way of speaking. But when the song ended and they stepped apart, he asked very softly, "What do you want to find while you are here?" Sophie looked toward the dark crease of the river. She could have said pastries. She could have said a photograph no one else had taken. She could have said a tidy piece of travel, prose that would let readers feel as if they had slept well and eaten buttered bread. Something true, she said. Something that matters to people who are not being watched. He considered that, and a flicker of something like worry passed through his eyes before it smoothed itself away. We will find what is true, he said, and we will be careful with it. The way he said, we landed gently in her chest. They made their way back to the inn, along a lane that smelled faintly of rosemary and rain. At the door, the proprietor had left a plate under a cloth. Daniel lifted the corner as if unwrapping an heirloom. Cherry cake, blushing politely under a dust of sugar. Wisdom awaits, he said. They ate in companionable quiet, at a small table by the window. The street cat leapt to the sill and pretended not to be interested in them. Daniel left the larger piece for Sophie without remark. Do you always insist on cake? She asked. Only when it is needed, he said, and sometimes when it is not. Sophie's laugh came out softer than usual. She felt pleasantly tired in that way. That means the day has been exactly enough. What time tomorrow? She asked, reaching for her notebook. For the woodcarvers and the dance rehearsal, I would like to watch the children try to be serious. Let us meet after breakfast, he said, at the heir fountain. If it rains, we will follow the smell of cinnamon instead of the schedule. She closed the notebook without writing anything down. That sounds like a plan I can trust. At the stairs, he paused. The tavern's low light gilded the edges of him, and she thought again of long halls and paintings, of portraits that pretend to be still and are not. He looked as if he had practiced the art of saying goodnight in many languages. "Sleep well, Sophie," he said, and her name, wrapped in that steady voice, made the room feel warmer. "Good night, Daniel," she returned. "Thank you for not letting me fall into the river." "Any time," he said, and the small smile he gave her was not the smile he gave the city. It felt particular. It felt like the beginning of a story. Sophie slept with the window cracked, the city breathing in and out like a tide. Once, in the small hours, a distant bell struck and seemed to fold the darkness a little closer. She dreamt of a lantern drifting downstream and of a hand finding hers in a crowd, with the natural certainty of two puzzle pieces finally touching. At dawn, pale light found the rooftops. She woke with a sense of readiness, the kind that wanted a notebook and a pair of good shoes. She brewed the little kettle, sipped tea by the window, and watched the street stretch itself awake. The cat yawned, dismissed her, and disappeared along the gutter, like a shadow with good intentions. Downstairs, the innkeeper set a plate in front of her that could have fed a small orchestra: thick toast, soft eggs, jam as bright as rubies. Daniel arrived as she lifted her cup, and the room seemed to take one deeper breath. He wore the same jacket, as if it were the uniform of a person with practical kindness, and he carried a paper bag from the bakery. "For later," he said, "in case we need to bribe a story out of a violin." "You come prepared," she said. And then, because the book of questions in her mind had turned a page, "Tell me something true about you." He folded a corner of the bag down, thinking. "I prefer quiet churches to busy museums," he said. "I am fond of dogs that look like philosophers. I know 3 lullabies and will deny this if asked in public, and I have been told I am better at leaving than at arriving." Sophie held his gaze. "Then I am glad you arrived." He inclined his head, a motion so small and sincere it felt like the laying down of a burden. "And you," he said, "I am glad you are here." Outside, the day promised clean light. They walked to the hair fountain, then into the snug of streets where the woodcarvers worked with their doors open. The air filled with the slow rasp of knives and the warm, sweet scent of shaved pine. Everywhere, festival preparations continued. A ribbon tied here, a stool set there, a song tested and abandoned and tried again. Sophie moved through it with the gentle alertness of someone who both belonged and did not. Daniel was a quiet corridor that opened doors. He translated sparingly, only when needed, and otherwise let people speak in their own music. When she knelt to photograph a child painting a wooden bird, Daniel shifted slightly so that anyone passing would naturally drift around them instead of through. When she stood to ask a baker about an oven older than democracy, Daniel found the spot of shade that would keep both of them from squinting into their conversation. By late morning, she had pages of notes and a camera, humming with images she wanted to live inside. At a corner stall, that sold only pears and patience, an older man tipped his hat at Daniel in a way that suggested they knew each other better than names. "You are liked," she observed. "I buy pears," Daniel said, as if that were the sum of the thing. She looked at him sideways. "And you count exits," she added, because by then she had learned the shape of his attention. He did not deny it. "It is a habit," he said. "The city and I have an agreement. I watch her, and she lets me keep watch." "I am a guest," she said. "But I think the city is already letting me borrow a key." "She is generous," he replied, soft as a blessing. They reached the river again near midday, the water a calm strip of light under a clear sky. Sophie glanced along the far bank and stilled. A man leaned against the railing a bit too casually, a cap pulled low, a newspaper raised without moving through its pages. Sophie would not have noticed him in another place. But here, where ease was the default posture, the intentness of him rang like a sour note. She felt Daniel notice at the same instant. It was not a flinch. It was the tiniest realignment of attention, the way one might tilt a mirror to catch more light. "Shall we take the lower road?" he asked, as if suggesting a scenic detour. "Of course," she said, and did not look back. As they turned, she heard him exhale. Not worry, not yet. Just a recalculation. She thought of the way he had held her steady on the bridge, and of the steadiness now, invisible and not. The thought that followed arrived as lightly as a feather. Trust him. She did. They walked on, the city unfolding with its measured grace. They would visit the dancers, then the chapel with the blue ceiling, then the baker who pretended he disliked compliments. Sophie would write about all of it that evening, warm with tea and the memory of music. But for now, with sun on stone and festival ribbons lifting in the breeze, she let this new companionship take root, quiet, observant, and promising as a lantern waiting to be lit. And if his hand brushed hers when they rounded the corner, if the touch lingered a breath longer than it needed to, neither of them said so. The moment tucked itself away, safe as a secret in a pocket, and the day kept walking toward whatever would come next. Chapter 2, Cobblestones and Clues. The morning had that delicate crispness Sophie loved, the kind that made the edges of buildings seem sharper, the air cleaner, and the smell of bread impossible to resist. The festival had fully awakened overnight. Stalls had sprung up along the cobblestone lanes, like bright mushrooms after rain, each one draped in bunting or patterned cloth. Baskets of apples glowed under the sun. Ribbons of every color fluttered from poles, and the cheerful notes of a fiddle laced through the hum of conversation. Daniel met her at the hair fountain just after breakfast, carrying a paper bag that looked suspiciously like it came from the bakery. He handed it to her without preamble. "For later," he said, as though this were a perfectly ordinary ritual between them. Almond pastries. They go quickly on festival days. Sophie accepted the bag with a smile. "You're a dangerous man, Daniel Cross. You could tempt me off any schedule with pastries." "Noted," he said, a small curve at his mouth betraying amusement. They began walking toward the artisan quarter, where the streets narrowed and curved like threads being woven. Sophie kept her notebook handy, jotting observations how the cobblestones in the oldest lane were worn smooth as river stones, how a man in a green cap could carve a bird from a block of wood in less than 5 minutes, how the smell of roasting chestnuts clung to the air like a fond memory. Daniel seemed to know every turn, every vendor, and every shortcut. He spoke to stall keepers in a mix of Albrecht's lilting language and English, translating only when Sophie looked intrigued enough to ask. She noticed how easily people smiled at him, how hands lingered on his arm in greeting, how children waved without hesitation. It was the kind of acceptance that came from being both known and trusted. At one stall, Sophie lingered over a display of delicate glass ornaments shaped like flowers. A woman with kind eyes explained the tradition, how each ornament was meant to hold a single wish for the year ahead. Daniel listened, watching Sophie more than the glass, as if her reaction mattered most. "Which would you choose?" he asked when they stepped away. She considered. "The violet," she said finally. "It feels quiet, but it has its own strength." "A fitting choice," he said. And she couldn't tell whether he meant the flower or her. They passed under a series of colorful awnings, pausing when the street opened into a small square. A troupe of dancers, in embroidered vests and skirts, rehearsed to the beat of a drum, their movements sharp but full of joy. Sophie raised her camera, capturing the sweep of a skirt, mid-spin, the laughing glance between two partners. When she lowered it, Daniel was watching her, not the dancers. "What?" she asked, a little self-conscious under his gaze. "You look," he seemed to weigh his words, "like you belong here." The remark settled warmly in her chest. "Maybe I do." They wandered again, weaving through a crowd gathered around a storyteller. The woman's voice rose and fell in the rhythm of a tale, and though Sophie couldn't understand every word, the cadence wrapped around her like a shawl. Daniel translated just enough for her to catch the heart of it. A story of a fox who traded his shadow for a crown, only to learn the shadow had been his truest protection. "Is that a warning?" she teased. "Perhaps," he said, and there was something in his tone, a flicker of something personal, that made her wonder if the fox meant more to him than a character in a folk tale. By midday, the crowd thickened, and the air warmed enough for Sophie to loosen her scarf. Daniel guided her toward a quieter street, his hand resting lightly at her back when the press of people grew too close. The contact was brief but steady, a wordless reassurance that she hadn't realized she wanted until it was there. They stopped at a small tavern tucked between two taller buildings. Inside, the light was amber, the tables well worn, and the smell of baking bread strong enough to make Sophie's stomach growl. "Hungry?" Daniel asked, though his knowing smile suggested he'd heard the answer. They shared a simple meal, thick slices of bread, soft cheese, and a small pot of spiced plum jam. It was nothing fancy, yet Sophie thought she might remember it long after the trip ended, if only because of the quiet ease that had settled between them. "Tell me something true," she said once they'd finished. Daniel took a slow sip from his cup before answering. "I've walked these streets more times than I can count. but they still surprise me. A new shop sign, a different laugh echoing in an alley. The city changes, even when it looks the same. Sophie considered that. That's a good reminder for a travel writer. Sometimes I get so focused on finding what's unique that I forget to look for what's changing. He nodded as though she'd confirmed something he'd suspected about her. After they left the tavern, they followed the curve of the river. The water glittered under the late afternoon light, and Sophie stopped to take a few photographs. On the far bank, she thought she saw a man leaning against the railing, the same man she'd noticed briefly the previous evening. The cap, the posture, it felt familiar enough to stir a quiet unease. When she glanced at Daniel, she saw that same subtle shift in his attention as before, the one that made her think of a chess player, considering the board. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Not at all," he said easily. "We should take the bridge ahead. The view's better." She didn't press him, though a small thread of curiosity wound itself tighter in her mind. By the time they returned to the inn, the first lanterns had been lit, casting soft halos of gold along the streets. Sophie paused outside her room, reluctant to let the day end. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me so much." "It's my job," he said. But there was warmth in his voice. "And my pleasure." She smiled, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the air between them held something unspoken, something that might one day be named. Chapter 3. The Whispered Truth. The inn's common room was quieter now. The earlier hum of festival goers, replaced by the low murmur of a few lingering guests and the occasional creak of the floorboards overhead. Sophie sat at a small table near the window, the lamplight pooling in soft gold around her. She'd taken out her notebook, intending to write, but the page remained stubbornly blank. The day had been too rich, too full of details, colors, and moments to distill into tidy sentences. Every time she tried, her mind circled back to Daniel. The way his hand had steadied her in the crowd, the way he'd looked at her during the storyteller's tale, the quiet cadence of his voice in the tavern. It had all settled somewhere deeper than she'd expected. Thinking about work? She glanced up to find Daniel standing beside her table, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair opposite her. "Trying to," she admitted. "It's not going well." "Good," he said simply, and pulled out the chair to sit. Sophie laughed softly. "That's not very encouraging." "It means you're enjoying yourself," he replied. "Sometimes you have to live the story before you write it." The warmth in his tone made her close the notebook altogether. "So what would you suggest, Mr. Cross?" "I'd suggest a walk. The streets are quieter now, and the lanterns are beautiful at night." They stepped out into the cool air, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. The festival's music had softened to the occasional distant fiddle, or the laughter of a group making their way home. The cobblestones glistened faintly from an earlier drizzle, reflecting the lantern light in broken fragments. Daniel led her down a side street, lined with ivy-clad walls and shuttered windows. His steps were unhurried, his presence steady beside her. Sophie found herself matching her pace to his without thinking. "You seem to know exactly where to go," she said. "I've spent a lot of time here," he answered. "These streets are like a second home." She glanced at him, catching a flicker in his eyes, a shadow of something unspoken. "And your first home?" she asked lightly. He hesitated just enough for her to notice. "Different," he said at last, "and not nearly as peaceful." The words intrigued her, but the tone suggested she shouldn't press, not yet. They reached a small square, where a stone fountain murmured quietly to itself. A single lantern hung from an iron post, casting light over the carved figures of swans and lilies. Sophie ran her fingers lightly along the fountain's cool edge. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Daniel studied her instead. "It is." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was filled with the soft night sounds, water trickling, a distant church bell marking the hour, the faint rustle of leaves overhead. Sophie felt something shift in the air, a subtle closeness that had nothing to do with their physical distance. Then, from the corner of her eye, she caught movement at the far edge of the square. A man in a dark coat stood half-shadowed beneath an archway, seemingly watching them. When she looked directly, he turned and disappeared down another lane. Daniel noticed. She could tell by the way his posture tightened, his gaze following the spot where the man had been. "Do you know him?" she asked. "No," Daniel said, after a moment. But his tone was guarded. "It's probably nothing." Sophie's instincts as a journalist stirred. "You don't seem convinced." He glanced at her, the lantern light catching the faint crease between his brows. "Let's just say I'm careful about strangers." They continued walking, though she could feel the subtle change in him, more alert, more attuned to their surroundings. His hand brushed hers once, and she thought it might have been accidental, until it happened again, this time lingering just enough to feel deliberate. Back at the inn, Daniel paused outside her door. "Lock this when you're inside," he said gently, as though it were simply practical advice. "I will," she promised. He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything at all, knock on my door." The words felt heavier than they should have, weighted with the quiet seriousness she'd heard in his voice before. Sophie nodded, meeting his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Sophie." When she closed the door, she found her heart was beating faster, not from the sighting in the square, but from the way he'd said her name, low and steady, as if it mattered to him. Chapter 4. Unmasking the Prince. Morning opened like a careful envelope, thin light, a hush over rooftops, the slow, familiar stirring of Albrecht's streets. Sophie woke to the small pleasures she had already grown to love, the kettle's soft breath, the inn-cat's brief royal inspection of the window ledge, the scent of bread lifting from the square. She wrote a little, then didn't. The words arrived, but kept circling one name, one voice. She left the page as it was and went down to breakfast. Daniel stood by the tavern door as if he had been folded there by the morning. He held a paper cup with steam curling from it, and offered it to her without preamble. "Cinnamon chocolate," he said. "The baker made me swear not to call it cocoa. She says it is a winter memory." Sophie smiled, palms warm around the cup. "Then good morning to winter memories." They walked toward the hair fountain, not in a hurry, letting the city set the pace. Festival day unfolded with unforced cheer, ribbons bright in the sun, a stand of violins trying themselves awake, a little boy wearing a paper crown because the day had decided he should. Sophie and Daniel did not speak much, and it felt like the right conversation. After a time, he led her down a quieter lane, the kind that seems to make its own shadow. At the end stood a chapel no larger than a cottage. Its door was blue, worn by weather and hands, and above it a small window held a circle of glass, the color of seaweed. "I thought we might rest a moment," he said. "It is cool here, and no one minds if you let your breath catch up." Inside, the stone held a soft chill. Candles flickered at a side altar, their flames making small, steady work of darkness. A polished bench ran along the wall, and Sophie sat, the wood fitting her back as if it had been shaped by 100 quiet spines before hers. Daniel remained standing for a heartbeat longer than needed, as if weighing a choice, then sat beside her, a respectful distance and not at all far. The silence stretched companionable until he drew a breath and set it gently between them. "Sophie," he said, and the way he said her name felt like he was placing it somewhere safe. "I owe you the truth." She turned, her heart lifting and bracing at the same time. "All right." He studied his hands briefly, as if they were pages he must read with care, then lifted his gaze. "My name is Daniel by long habit, but not in law. I am Adrian. Adrian Albrecht." He let her see it arrive in his eyes before he said the words that followed. "I am the prince." Quiet is not always the absence of sound. Sometimes it is simply the world stepping back to make room. The chapel did that now. Even the candle scene seemed to listen. Sophie did not jump, or gasp, or fumble for a photograph she would never take. Instead, she found, to her own surprise, that the first thing waiting in her chest was not shock but recognition, some collection of small evidences, finally introducing themselves to one another. The way he counted exits without nerves, the way greetings changed around him, the careful practice of goodbyes, the watch that preferred plainness to announcement, the posture that tabulated risks without advertising fear. She released a breath she had not realized she held. "All right," she said softly again, not because she had not heard him, but because the word itself felt like a hand held out on level ground. He did not rush. While the festival brings joy, it also brings gatherings, and gatherings invite mischief. We received word that a story, your story, had stumbled near something certain men wanted, kept under stone. My family asked me to serve as your guide because I know the streets and because I am practiced at staying close without standing in the way. The man by the river and the other in the square, they were not simply curious. Sophie's fingers closed more firmly around the cup. It had cooled, but the scent of cinnamon and chocolate lingered. She thought of the man in the cap, the angle of his shoulder as he pretended to lean without looking. She thought of Daniel's hand at her back in the crowd, steady and unhurried. She thought of the story she had promised to bring home, a lullaby of bread and blue ceilings. "Then I did step near a live wire," she murmured. "You brushed it," he said, gentling the words as if they might sting. There are whispers of contracts hidden in festival budgets, of funds intended for restoration, redirected through clever hands to places where they grow and cast different shadows. The names attached are not all villains, but a few are very fond of the word deserve. Sophie let the quiet shelter them both a moment before she spoke. "I am not here to break anything that holds people together, but I am not here to leave lies unwatered either." Something eased in his shoulders at that, as if a hinge had moved freely at last. "You are here for truth told in a voice that lets people sleep." She allowed a small smile. "That is the hope." He nodded once, gratitude steady in his expression. "There is more," he said, and the candlelight made the words sound softer than steel. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but telling you would have painted a target on a larger canvas." Sophie's eyes lifted to the small sea glass window, then back to him. "And now? Now you know what I have long known," he said gently, "that telling the truth is an intimacy." The words settled in, finding the places where last night's unspoken things still glowed. She set the cup on the bench beside her and folded her hands. "Will you show me how to walk this without setting it on fire?" He looked almost relieved. "I can do better. I will walk it with you." She studied his face in the chapel's dim calm. The prince did not look different from the guide, but the truth freshened everything she already knew. The quiet watchfulness, the impulse to cushion the world for others without making noise about the act. The way he had asked her to lock her door, not as a command, but as a kindness. The man and the name aligned at last. Sophie reached for his hand. It was a simple thing, done without ceremony, the way one reaches for a railing when the stairs turn. He turned his palm to meet hers and closed his fingers, firm and gentle. "What happens now?" she asked. "We keep doing what we were doing," he said. "We eat bread and we listen and we let people tell us what is true for them. If a path opens toward proof, we take it together." He paused. "And if it does not, then your story will still be the one you came to write. The one that lets the kingdom see itself kindly." "And the men with clever pockets?" she asked, quiet, not afraid. He did not look away. "They will find a different season, or a different country." The corner of her mouth tipped up. "You say that in a voice that makes me think of stone walls." "Then the walls have learned their manners," he said, and the chapel's small light felt suddenly like a blessing meant for two. They lingered not because they must, but because the room was good at keeping confidences. At last they rose. Outside, the day had climbed fully into itself, and the square beyond the lane had brightened with sunlight and violin scales. Daniel, Adrian, walked beside her, not closer, not farther, simply as he had before, and entirely new. "Adrian," she said, testing the name in the open air. His eyes softened as if she had pronounced a password. Only she was meant to know. "Yes," "It suits you," she said. "Thank you," he replied. "May I keep Daniel until tonight? It will spare you a great many bows, and me a great many questions." "You may keep Daniel as long as you like," she said. "I am fond of him." "I am too," he admitted, and it felt like a small private joke shared across a table. They returned to the festival as if they had stepped out to fetch a quiet note and would now rejoin the music. The day went on with the work of joy, bread cut and handed across counters, children shepherded out of puddles and into dances, a storyteller tidying her endings with a bow. Adrian introduced her to a luthier who swore he could hear the weather. Sophie photographed the grain of maple like islands on a map. They spoke with a woman who kept the accounts for a district of workshops. Her numbers had the ring of prayer beads, counted, known, reliable. And yet, under them, a soft rattle, a grant that had slipped sideways, a promised roof that had not mended, a set of invoices, paid from a fund whose name had been edited until it meant nothing at all. "I do not want trouble," the woman said, her eyes moving to Adrian and away with the faint deference people give to men who carry unseen keys. "I want short words and honest paper." "You deserve both," Sophie said. "Would you speak to me in the museum after closing? I will bring no camera, only a notebook and bread." The woman considered, then nodded. "Bread persuades courage," she said. As they left the workshop street, Sophie felt again that prickle at the back of the neck that is not fear but attention. Across the way, near a row of planters, where rosemary grew like generosity, the man in the cap stood with arms folded loosely. He did not feign reading this time. He only tilted his head, as if memorizing faces. Adrian's hand reached for Sophie's without asking or explanation. She took it as naturally as one takes the next stair. They walked on, speaking of pears, of paint, of why blue makes a ceiling higher. The man in the cap did not follow. "Do you trust the museum?" Sophie asked when they turned toward the river, where the afternoon gleamed as if someone had polished it. "With my childhood," Adrian said, "and with the secrets children overhear." Then there, she decided. They attended a rehearsal in a hall where sunlight fell from high windows like soft banners. They tasted a soup of herbs and barley that seemed designed for tired bones. They sat on a low wall and listened to a handful of fiddlers tune their strings until the air itself felt in tune. At each step, Sophie collected small truths that would make a gentle article. How flour dusted sleeves like snow. How a baker brushed off compliments, because compliments stuck worse than flour. How a girl learning the festival steps counted softly under her breath and then dared the leap and kept going. Dusk asked for room. Lanterns woke along the streets one by one, each answering the next, like friends calling to say, "I am here." The inn's proprietor sang a little in the kitchen when she thought no one listened. The cat returned to the window to take attendance of the night. Sophie and Adrian sat with cups of tea, no longer pretending to be hot. Papers lay between them like stepping stones. The workshop numbers the woman had let Sophie copy. A note from Pearl at the museum promising an office after hours. An index card. with a name Adrian had written in careful print, a treasurer to a committee with a fondness for renaming things. "It is a knot," Sophie said, "but not one a good needle cannot unpick." Adrian traced a line between two notes with his fingertip, not touching the ink, only the idea. "If the thread we pull gives way, we will let it fall without noise," he said. "But if it holds, we will bring it into light the way one carries a candle through a dark room, slowly for the sake of those sleeping, and firmly for the sake of those who trip." Sophie inclined her head. "Let us try the door," she murmured, the phrase she always used for stories that might be doors or simply well-painted walls. After the evening meal, they walked to the museum by a route Pearl had drawn for Adrian on the back of a receipt, complete with whimsical commentary about which cobbles were likely to misbehave. The museum was a small palace of patience, its rooms cool and well kept, its glass cases honest in their modesty. Pearl met them with a key in one hand and a bowl of hard candies in the other. "You did not hear this from me," she said cheerfully, ushering them into a little office that smelled like old paper and lavender sachets. But a ledger may forget a lie sooner than a lady of a certain age will. "Now, what truth shall we not shout?" Sophie explained. "Not the palace or the crown, only the invoices and the grants, the roof that had not found its tiles, the grant that had worn 3 names in as many seasons." Pearl listened, chin lifted, as if the story were a tune she was not yet sure how to hum along to. "Ah," she said, when Sophie finished, "the renaming game. Children play that with kittens to confuse parents. Governments play it with budgets to confuse everyone. Let me see what the guild's minutes say. They keep public notes and private ones. The public are in a glass case. The private are in my head." Pearl opened a drawer and produced a carefully folded list of meeting dates. "This line," she tapped, "belongs to the committee you named. The day after this, a donation arrives at the museum with all the right signatures in all the wrong places. We made a polite fuss. The treasurer made a polite apology. I made a note of who declined biscuits." Sophie followed the dates, then followed the path of numbers as one follows a stream by the sound it makes beneath leaves. At last she rested her pencil. "A quiet piece," she said. "No names shouted, only a story about how the festival belongs to everyone who lives it. How the money meant for roofs should hold up skies, not ambitions." "And a little mention," Pearl added briskly, "that the museum's regulator gives the same time to rich and poor. Oh, I like this story. It lets boys with new shoes and girls with old ones walk side by side." Adrian looked at Sophie, not as a prince, not as a guard, simply as a man relieved to find language that could hold both care and courage. "Will you write it?" "Yes," she said. "Tonight. And I will send it to my editor, along with photographs of red and blue ceilings, so that the piece arrives on a pillow." Pearl fixed Adrian with a look that mothers reserve for sons who are taller than their sense of sleep. "And you will let your steps be ordinary again for a while." "For a while," he promised. They thanked her, declined the candy, accepted it when she insisted, and slipped into the night. The streets held their soft festival hush. A handful of young men practiced harmonies at the edge of the square. Somewhere, a window opened and someone clapped. Not at them, not at anything, just to join in. When they reached the inn door, they did not go in at once. Sophie leaned against the cool stone and looked up. The stars here were not bolder than in the cities she knew, but they felt closer, like neighbors across a narrow lane. Adrian stood beside her, hands in his pockets, the way ordinary men put their hands there when they do not know where to put wonder. "I like your kingdom," she said simply. "I like it better tonight," he answered. She turned to him. There is a moment at the end of certain days when the heart settles on a choice it has been making quietly all along. Sophie found that moment now. "And you," she said, not whispering, not declaring, just setting the truth upon the small shared table between them. "I like you very much." Adrian's breath caught, the way a page does when a reader's thumb hesitates at the corner. He stepped a half-pace closer, not to crowd the moment, but to be sure he belonged in it. "Sophie," he said, and her name felt different now, that everything else had been said. "If I asked, not as a prince, not as a guide, if I asked as the man who danced badly with you, and counted exits and brought almond pastries, would you let me keep walking with you after the festival goes back to being only a week in a year?" She smiled without feeling the need to make it clever. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He raised a hand then, and with the same respectful certainty he used on doors and delicate hinges, he cupped her cheek. She tipped her face into his palm, as into a light. He kissed her, softly, without hunger, as if he had studied long enough to know that some doors open inward when you do not push. The kiss tasted faintly, of tea and cinnamon, and the relief of names kept and shared. When they parted, the inn cat appeared upon the sill, looked at them as if they had rearranged the furniture correctly at last, and disappeared again. Sophie laughed, quiet with happiness. "Official approval," she said. "High honors," Adrian agreed gravely. They said good night for real then, the kind of good night that does not ache because morning is close. Sophie wrote in her room, with the window open, the words landing without fuss, the story curving toward the kind of ending that lets a reader close their eyes without worry. She tilted the emphasis toward people who mended, not those who meddled, toward the balance of a community that knows how to keep the hour true. She sent the piece while the night still breathed, along with photographs that would look like kindness in print. In the morning, the magazine wrote back faster than time zones usually allowed a note from Nora that sounded like a smile. "You found something true, and you wrapped it in blue ceilings and bread. Perfect." Sophie read it twice, then tucked the phone away. Outside, bells counted a patient hour. They spent that last day of the festival doing nothing new and everything they had done, watching children try very hard to be serious, listening to fiddles, forget to be accurate, and remember to be joyful, sharing a piece of cherry cake under a string of lanterns just beginning to glow. When the lantern walk returned to the river, the priest spoke words that had learned how to fit whatever year they entered. Adrian kept Sophie near the inside of the path without making a ceremony of it. She did not stumble. He steadied her anyway. At the bridge, she looked sideways at him. "Will you be Daniel more often than Adrian. "I will be both," he said. "But for us, I would like to be a man who buys pears and burns the soup and gets better at dancing." "You are already good at the important parts," she said. The lanterns tipped to the river, and light went downstream like a blessing learning to travel. People sighed in the way people sigh when something is ending without being over. The music changed to something you could walk home to. They paused at the arch to the inn. The proprietor hummed inside, a sound like ribbon. The cat, having watched the river from a very sensible distance, pawed the door until someone opened it like a servant. Sophie lifted her camera and did not take a photograph. "For the memory," Adrian said. "For the memory," she echoed, and took his hand. The story would become a printed thing, soft edges, warm light, a kingdom shown to itself as kind and careful. Contracts would be reviewed more slowly. A treasurer would forget to rename a fund and discover he liked plain words after all. Pearl would add a note to her minutes that simply read, "We remembered what time is for," and tuck a hard candy in between the pages, as if sweetness could keep the paper from yellowing. The museum's regulator would tick on, impartial to weather and wealth. Sophie would go home, and then come back, and then home again, because love is a kind of traveling even when you stay put. Adrian would be the prince when the kingdom asked it of him, and the man in a plain jacket when the day did not. They would write to each other in sentences that did not require the post to hurry. When they were in the same place, they would walk the long way to the bakery without saying why. And often, more often than the calendar would predict, they would stand on the bridge and watch the water carry lantern light toward a bend, trusting that what drifted out of sight did not disappear, only turned into something they would see again from another shore. On the last evening, when the street fell quiet and the square finally allowed itself to rest, Adrian touched the doorframe of the inn and looked at Sophie, the way a man looks when he has found not a crown, not a country, but a home. "Come back soon," he said. She leaned into him, the answer already woven into the day. "I will, and when I cannot, write me about pears." "I will write you about blue ceilings," he said, "and about cats that appoint themselves to royalty, and about cinnamon chocolate," she added, "and about how the city changes," he finished, "even when it looks the same." They kissed once more, like a seal on a letter neither of them would misplace. Then they went inside, and the night folded itself around Albrecht with the comfortable weight of a quilt. The kingdom kept its ordinary wonders. The prince in disguise learned he did not always have to be. The journalist who had come for bread and music left with both and with a hand to hold whenever she crossed a crowded bridge. The lanterns dimmed, the river whispered, the clocks did their small, faithful work. Somewhere, a baker covered dough and whispered a good night only flower hears. And in the quiet inn-room, with the window cracked to the alley, and the stars, Sophie Bennett slept with a smile that felt like a new address, one that said simply, "Sophie, care of the gentlest truth. Thank you for listening to Moonlit Romantic." In the quiet of that seaside town, he discovered freedom. He discovered himself, and he discovered her. If the prince in disguise left a place in your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that love is the greatest title we can ever hold. Until next time, sleep softly, dream deeply, and remember, sometimes you have to hide who you are to find who you're meant to be.